Nietzsche did not see himself as a revolutionary ushering in a new age. He saw himself as someone fundamentally out of step with his own. This distinction matters. Revolutionaries believe history is moving in their direction. Nietzsche believed history was moving away from what mattered most: depth, strength, honesty, and the capacity to create values. 19th-century Europe was intoxicated with progress. Science was advancing rapidly. Nation-states were consolidating power, industry promised prosperity, education promised enlightenment, and history itself seemed to point toward improvement. Nietzsche distrusted this optimism instinctively. To him, progress was not a guarantee of elevation. It was often a mask for decline. Nietzsche believed every age produces its own form of self-deception. His age's deception was the belief that material, political, and technological progress automatically translated into cultural and spiritual strength. Nietzsche saw the opposite. He believed modern Europe was becoming more efficient, more organized, and more comfortable, while simultaneously becoming shallower, more resentful, and less capable of greatness. This is why Nietzsche repeatedly describes himself as untimely. He did not speak in the language of his contemporaries, and he did not share their enthusiasms. He attacked ideas that were widely celebrated and refused to defend ideas that were under attack. This made him appear reactionary to some and dangerously radical to others. In reality, Nietzsche belonged fully to neither camp. Nietzsche's criticism of his time was not nostalgic. He was not calling for a return to the past. He rejected romanticism, sentimentality, and blind traditionalism just as fiercely as he rejected modern moral optimism. His position was more uncomfortable. He believed his age had lost something vital and did not even realize it was gone. This sense of cultural loss explains the urgency and sharpness of his writing. Nietzsche was not debating fine points within an accepted framework. He was questioning the framework itself. He suspected that the moral language of his time, its talk of progress, equality, compassion, and reason, concealed a deeper exhaustion. Values, he believed, were being preserved long after the instincts that created them had withered. To stand against one's time in this way is costly. Nietzsche knew he would be misunderstood, marginalized, and dismissed as excessive or unhealthy. But he believed that genuine philosophy often appears first as heresy. A thinker who fits neatly into their age is rarely seeing it clearly. Nietzsche's stance against his time sets the stage for everything that follows: his critique of nationalism, his break with Wagner, his diagnosis of decadence, and his hostility toward mass movements. He was not reacting to isolated ideas. He was responding to what he saw as a civilizational trajectory moving toward comfort, conformity, and spiritual fatigue. To understand Nietzsche, then, is to understand him not as a thinker of modernity, but as a thinker against it, writing from inside his age, but refusing to speak its language. Nietzsche lived through the unification of Germany in 1871, an event celebrated by most of his contemporaries as a historic triumph. National identity, political strength, and cultural pride surged. For many German intellectuals, the new Reich represented destiny fulfilled. Nietzsche saw something else entirely. From the beginning, Nietzsche distrusted nationalism. He viewed it as a form of collective vanity, a way for individuals to inflate themselves by association with something larger. Nationalism, in his eyes, encouraged mediocrity by rewarding belonging over excellence. It replaced personal achievement with inherited pride and demanded loyalty where critical thought should prevail. Nietzsche was especially hostile to German nationalism because he believed it confused power with culture. Military success and political consolidation were mistaken for spiritual strength. Nietzsche saw this as a dangerous substitution. A nation could dominate territorially while decaying culturally. In fact, he believed this was precisely what was happening. He described himself pointedly as a good European, not a German nationalist. This was not cosmopolitan posturing. It was a rejection of parochial identity. Nietzsche admired French clarity, Italian vitality, and ancient Greek culture far more than what he saw as the heaviness and moralizing tone of modern German thought. He feared that nationalism would trap thinkers inside ideological loyalty tests, stifling intellectual independence. Nietzsche's opposition to nationalism also explains his rejection of anti-Semitism, which was gaining traction in German intellectual circles at the time. He despised it not only as crude prejudice, but as a symptom of ressentiment, a way of blaming an external group for internal weakness. Nietzsche broke with friends and publishers over their embrace of anti-Semitic rhetoric, isolating himself further in the process. Importantly, Nietzsche did not oppose all forms of collective identity. What he opposed was the moral elevation of the collective over the individual. Nationalism demanded sacrifice without guaranteeing excellence. It rewarded obedience, conformity, and emotional enthusiasm, traits Nietzsche associated with herd morality. For Nietzsche, the new German Reich exemplified modernity's core illusion that scale equals strength. Bigger institutions, bigger armies, bigger identities, all presented as progress. Nietzsche believed this expansion masked a shrinking of spirit. The individual thinker, creator, and value maker was being drowned out by collective noise. This stance made Nietzsche deeply unpopular in his own country. He attacked what others celebrated and celebrated what others attacked. But his resistance to nationalism was not reactionary, it was diagnostic. He believed that cultures decay not when they are defeated, but when they confuse power with worth. Nietzsche's rejection of nationalism foreshadows his broader critique of mass movements. Whether political, religious, or moral, movements that demand identification over individuation were to him symptoms of cultural exhaustion, not renewal. No relationship shaped Nietzsche's early intellectual life more powerfully than his friendship with Richard Wagner. For a time, Wagner represented everything Nietzsche believed modern culture still could be: daring, profound, life-affirming, and capable of producing greatness rather than merely managing decline. When Nietzsche first encountered Wagner's music, he experienced it as a cultural revelation. Wagner's operas appeared to revive something Nietzsche believed had been lost since ancient Greece, a synthesis of art, myth, and meaning powerful enough to confront life's deepest tensions. In Wagner, Nietzsche thought he had found an artist who could counter modern nihilism not with argument but with creative force. Their personal relationship deepened quickly. Wagner treated Nietzsche with warmth and attention, and Nietzsche responded with admiration bordering on devotion. He saw Wagner not merely as a composer, but as a cultural physician, someone whose art could restore vitality to a fatigued civilization. This belief culminated in Nietzsche's early work, The Birth of Tragedy, which frames Wagner as the modern inheritor of Dionysian art. What attracted Nietzsche to Wagner was not spectacle but seriousness. Wagner's music did not aim to comfort or distract. It overwhelmed, disturbed, and demanded surrender. For Nietzsche, this was the opposite of decadent art. It confronted suffering honestly rather than numbing it. In an age drifting toward shallow entertainment and moral reassurance, Wagner seemed to offer depth. At this stage, Nietzsche believed art could do what philosophy and religion no longer could: affirm life without lying about it. Wagner appeared to embody that possibility. Their alliance felt like resistance against modern mediocrity, a stand for intensity, discipline, and cultural ambition. This hope matters because it shows Nietzsche was not born a destroyer. He wanted renewal. He searched for sources of strength wherever he could find them. His later critiques would be sharpened precisely because he had once believed in something deeply and watched it fail. The Wagner Nietzsche admired was not yet the nationalist icon or moral preacher Wagner would become. He was a symbol of artistic honesty and cultural courage. Nietzsche's later break with Wagner would therefore not be casual disagreement, but a profound disillusionment, one that would reshape Nietzsche's entire understanding of art, culture, and modernity. Nietzsche's break with Wagner was not sudden, and it was not superficial. It unfolded slowly, painfully, and with growing clarity. What Nietzsche came to reject in Wagner was not merely a change in musical style or personal temperament, but a deeper shift in values, a shift Nietzsche believed mirrored the sickness of modern culture itself. As Wagner's public stature grew, Nietzsche watched him transform. The artist of danger and depth became a cultural institution. Wagner began to court German nationalism, Christian symbolism, and mass appeal. His later works, particularly Parsifal, struck Nietzsche as a betrayal of everything Wagner had once represented. What had been tragic affirmation now felt like moral sermonizing. What had been Dionysian intoxication became Christian redemption in disguise. Nietzsche experienced this as a personal and philosophical shock. Wagner, whom he had believed capable of resisting modern decadence, had instead capitulated to it. Rather than confronting suffering honestly, Wagner now offered consolation. Rather than demanding strength, he sanctified weakness. For Nietzsche, this was unforgivable, not because consolation is always wrong, but because it masqueraded as profundity. The disillusion cut deeply because Nietzsche recognized something familiar in Wagner's turn. It was the temptation Nietzsche himself had fought, the urge to soften truth for acceptance, to trade danger for applause, to replace artistic honesty with moral reassurance. Wagner's success confirmed Nietzsche's suspicion that modern audiences reward what flatters their moral self-image. Nietzsche did not accuse Wagner of cynicism. He believed Wagner was sincere, and that sincerity made the problem worse. Wagner truly believed in the redemptive power of his later art, but sincerity for Nietzsche was not enough. A belief can be heartfelt and still be life-denying. Wagner's art, Nietzsche concluded, no longer strengthened life. It pacified it. This realization forced Nietzsche to abandon one of his last hopes for cultural renewal through art. If even Wagner, the most powerful artist of the age, could not resist the pull of nationalism, Christianity, and mass sentiment, then the problem was deeper than individual failure. It was civilizational. The break isolated Nietzsche further. Wagner was revered. To criticize him was to invite ridicule and dismissal. Nietzsche accepted this cost. His later writings on Wagner are merciless, sometimes cruel, but they are not petty. They are diagnostic. Wagner became, for Nietzsche, a case study in how greatness decays when it begins to serve moral comfort rather than creative truth. This disillusion sharpened Nietzsche's understanding of decadence. Decadence was not simply weakness or decline, it was the inability to resist consolation, the preference for emotional reassurance over dangerous honesty. Wagner, in Nietzsche's eyes, had become a symptom of this condition. The break with Wagner marked a turning point. Nietzsche would no longer look to artists, nations, or movements for redemption. Whatever strength remained would have to be forged without collective hope. Nietzsche's critique of his age ultimately crystallized around a single concept: decadence. By this, he did not mean moral corruption in the conventional sense, nor did he mean simple decline. Decadence, for Nietzsche, was a physiological and psychological condition, a weakening of instincts that leads a culture to value what diminishes life rather than what intensifies it. Modernity, in Nietzsche's eyes, was decadent not because it was immoral, but because it was tired. It sought comfort over challenge, security over risk, reassurance over greatness. The language of progress masked this fatigue. Beneath the optimism of science, democracy, and mass education, Nietzsche sensed a growing inability to endure tension, contradiction, and suffering without escape. This is why Nietzsche distrusted modern moral enthusiasm. Movements that presented themselves as humane and enlightened often functioned as shelters from reality. They promised equality without excellence, compassion without cost, and meaning without struggle. Nietzsche did not deny the importance of care or fairness, but he believed that when these values become absolute, they suffocate the very forces that create culture in the first place. Decadent cultures, Nietzsche argued, moralize their weakness. They reinterpret exhaustion as virtue. Restraint becomes goodness, passivity becomes wisdom, and caution becomes moral superiority. Strength, by contrast, is reframed as brutality. Ambition becomes greed. Hierarchy becomes injustice. In this way, decadence preserves itself by attacking anything that threatens to exceed it. Nietzsche saw modern art, politics, and morality converging around this pattern. Rather than cultivating excellence, they aimed to eliminate discomfort. Rather than encouraging self-overcoming, they focused on protection and inclusion. For Nietzsche, this was not progress. It was stagnation, a slow flattening of human possibility. What made this particularly dangerous was that decadence no longer recognized itself as such. It believed it was moral. It believed it was rational. It believed it was inevitable. Nietzsche feared a future in which decline would no longer feel tragic, but righteous, where weakness would no longer seek excuse, but demand recognition. This diagnosis was not reactionary nostalgia. Nietzsche did not want to return to ancient hierarchies or aristocratic privilege. He wanted conditions under which greatness could still emerge. Decadence, as he understood it, made this increasingly difficult by treating difference as threat and intensity as pathology. Modernity, then, was not doomed, but it was sick. And like all sickness, Nietzsche believed it could either be confronted honestly or concealed beneath moral language. His role, as he saw it, was not to cure, but to diagnose, and to refuse participation in the lie that everything was getting better. Nietzsche's hostility toward mass movements was not political in the modern sense. He was not aligning himself with one ideology against another. His objection ran deeper. Mass movements, whether nationalist, religious, moral, or revolutionary, shared a psychological structure he distrusted. They replaced individual responsibility with collective identity. For Nietzsche, mass movements offer a powerful temptation. They allow individuals to feel significant without becoming strong, righteous without becoming disciplined, and meaningful without creating values of their own. Belonging substitutes for achievement. Moral enthusiasm substitutes for self-overcoming. The individual dissolves into the crowd and calls this dissolution virtue. This is why Nietzsche was suspicious even of movements that claimed to liberate. Liberation, when organized collectively, often demanded a new obedience. The slogans changed, but the psychology remained. Mass movements promised redemption from suffering by assigning blame outward, to enemies, systems, oppressors, or history itself. Nietzsche recognized this pattern immediately. It was resentment given structure. In mass movements, Nietzsche saw a reversal of responsibility. Instead of asking what one could become, individuals were encouraged to ask who was responsible for their condition. Moral language became accusatory rather than aspirational. Strength was treated as suspect, difference as injustice, and excellence as provocation. What could not be attained was condemned. This is why Nietzsche believed mass movements inevitably drift toward moral policing. Once a collective identity defines itself as righteous, deviation becomes betrayal. Independent thinking threatens cohesion. Nuance becomes danger. The movement survives by suppressing internal difference, often in the name of compassion, justice, or truth. Nietzsche did not deny that mass movements could produce change. He denied that they could produce greatness. They were efficient at leveling, not at elevating. They could destroy old structures, but they could not create new values without immediately stabilizing them into dogma. This hostility explains Nietzsche's isolation. He refused to belong, not because he was apolitical, but because belonging itself carried a psychological cost he was unwilling to pay. To stand apart was not oppose. It was the only way to preserve intellectual independence. Nietzsche feared a future dominated by organized moral enthusiasm, a world in which individuals no longer ask what they owe themselves, but only what they are entitled to demand from others. In such a world, morality becomes a language of pressure rather than aspiration. For Nietzsche, mass movements were not dangerous because they were evil, but because they were comforting. And comfort, when mistaken for virtue, was the surest sign of cultural exhaustion. Nietzsche believed that the most difficult stance a thinker can take is not opposition to the past, but opposition to the present. It is easy to reject what history has already condemned. It is far harder to resist what one's own age celebrates. Nietzsche understood this and accepted the cost. He wrote for readers who did not yet exist, in a language his contemporaries often found offensive, exaggerated, or pathological. Standing against one's own time does not mean reflexive contrarianism. Nietzsche was not rejecting modernity out of spite or nostalgia. He rejected it because he believed it was drifting toward a form of exhaustion disguised as moral progress. The danger, as he saw it, was not tyranny or barbarism, but comfort, a culture increasingly unable to tolerate tension, hierarchy, or the demand to become more than it already was. Nietzsche's refusal to align with his age explains his loneliness and his tone. He did not moderate his critique to remain relevant. He did not soften his language to remain acceptable. He believed that truth spoken too gently dissolves into reassurance. If his ideas were to have any force, they had to cut against the grain of contemporary values. This also explains Nietzsche's sense of being untimely. He did not expect immediate understanding. He expected resistance, distortion, and hostility. He believed that genuine ideas often arrive before the conditions exist to receive them. This is not prophetic arrogance, but historical awareness. Many thinkers who reshape culture are initially rejected precisely because they disrupt what feels settled. Nietzsche's stance against his time was therefore not despairing, but disciplined. He did not withdraw into cynicism or nihilism. He continued to write, refine, and clarify his diagnoses, even as his audience remained small. He believed that clarity itself was a form of responsibility, a refusal to participate in comforting falsehoods. What Nietzsche offers is not a blueprint for rebellion, but a standard of honesty. To stand against one's own time is to ask whether prevailing values actually strengthen life, or merely protect it from discomfort. It is to resist the pressure to conform morally before one has examined what morality is doing. This stance is why Nietzsche remains unsettling. He does not reassure us that our age is enlightened. He asks whether our enlightenment is a symptom of fatigue. He does not promise that history is moving in the right direction. He asks whether direction itself has been lost. Nietzsche stood against his time not to be remembered, but because he believed that thinking demanded it. That demand remains.